Deep within the Egyptian sand, wrapped in the linen folds of a dead pharaoh, lay a dagger that should not have existed. When Howard Carter unsealed the tomb of Tutankhamun, he found gold in abundance. Yet it was the blade strapped to the boy king's thigh that defied explanation. It was not gold nor bronze, but iron, a metal that, at that time, was worth far more than the rarest gems.
Not from the earth did this metal rise, but from the cosmos. Before humanity learned to tear the gray ore from the ground, our ancestors looked to the heavens for what they called the metal of the sky. These early artifacts were forged from meteorites that had plummeted to the surface, gifts from the gods that possessed a hardness unknown to the soft copper and bronze of the era.
Rarely does one consider how alien this material was to the ancients. To hold a piece of meteoric iron was to hold a fragment of a dying star, heavy and cold. It was a substance of prestige, reserved for rituals and royalty, maintained with a reverence we might today reserve for radioactive isotopes or sacred relics. But this celestial exclusivity was destined to change.
Buried beneath the soil, however, lay an abundance of terrestrial iron, locked away in reddish rocks and ochre dirt. The problem was not scarcity, but heat. To free the metal from the stone requires temperatures that the primitive fires of the Bronze Age simply could not achieve. Copper melts easily in a pottery kiln, but iron is stubborn, requiring a heat so intense it seemed impossible to generate. It was the Hittites, dwelling in the rugged anatomy of what is now Turkey, who first cracked this thermal code around the 2nd millennium BCE. Through experimentation and accident, they discovered that by limiting oxygen and using charcoal, they could induce a state of reduction. They did not melt the iron, for they lacked the technology, but they transformed it into a spongy, glowing mass known as a bloom. This process was a closely guarded state secret, a monopoly on the most potent material the world had ever seen. Seldom had a civilization held such a significant advantage. By hammering this hot bloom, they drove out the impurities, the glass-like slag, and created wrought iron. It was a moment of incipient, which means beginning to happen or develop, industry that would alter the fate of nations.
Yet, the transition from bronze to iron was not merely a technological upgrade. It was a desperate necessity born of collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the great trade networks of the Mediterranean disintegrated. The tin required to make bronze vanished from the markets as supply lines were severed by war and migration. Humanity did not choose iron because it was superior. They chose it because the old world was dying.
Scarcely could the blacksmiths of the era have predicted the consequences of this shift. Iron ore was democratic. It was found in every bog, mountain, and riverbed. No longer was a king dependent on tin from distant Afghanistan. A peasant could potentially arm himself. The monopoly of the elite charioteers was threatened by the sudden availability of a metal that was ugly, difficult to work, but terribly effective.
At first, this new metal was inferior to good bronze. It was softer, prone to bending, and rusted with frustrating speed. But the ancient smiths learned a surreptitious trick. By heating the iron in a bed of charcoal for extended periods, the metal absorbed carbon. This turned the soft iron into steel,
a material of such lethal capability that it redefined the very nature of violence. Never before had armor been so vulnerable. A bronze sword might bend against a shield, but a carbonized iron blade would bite through it. The auditory landscape of the battlefield changed from the dull thud of copper to the ringing clash of steel. It was a harsher, sharper sound, signaling a new age of brutality, where armies could be raised cheaply and equipped with weapons of mass destruction. The Assyrians were the first to fully weaponize this industrial capacity. They did not just use iron, they standardized it. Their armies marched with iron helmets, iron scales, and iron-tipped battering rams that pulverized the mud-brick walls of their enemies. In their hands, the metal ceased to be a curiosity and became an instrument of inexorable, which means impossible to stop or prevent, conquest. But we must not view this element solely through the lens of warfare. While the soldiers marched, the farmers revolutionized the earth. The iron plowshare was heavier and sharper than its wooden predecessor. It could cut through the dense, clay-heavy soils of northern Europe that had previously resisted cultivation. Forests were felled with iron axes, and populations surged as food production skyrocketed. This mundane application of the metal is often overshadowed by the glamour of swords, yet it is arguably more significant. Iron allowed humanity to colonize the difficult latitudes. It allowed for the construction of nails, clamps, and saws, enabling architecture to grow more complex. The wooden world was slowly being reinforced with a skeleton of gray metal, providing a rigidity that civilization had previously lacked. Far to the east, the Chinese masters were centuries ahead of their Western counterparts. While Europe hammered at spongy blooms, the Chinese had developed blast furnaces capable of melting iron completely. They cast liquid iron into molds, creating pots, pagodas, and agricultural tools with an efficiency the Romans could only dream of. Theirs was a mastery of high-temperature chemistry that the West would not replicate for a millennium. Little did the Romans know, as they built their empire, that their dominance relied heavily on the output of their mines. The Roman legionnaire was a machine of iron, from the hobnails in his sandals to the gladius at his hip. The state operated massive factories, churning out tons of metal to hold the empire together. Iron became the sinew of administration, the physical manifestation of Roman order. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval, the knowledge of ironworking became the benchmark of a culture's survival. The blacksmith became a figure of myth and magic, a man who controlled the elements of fire and earth to produce strength. The village smithy was the heart of the community, the place where the tools of life and the weapons of death were birthed from the same anvil. We see here a profound confluence of geology and destiny. The history of this gray metal is the history of human ambition. It is a story of taking the most common material in the Earth's crust and, through sweat and intellect, forcing it to bear the weight of our civilizations. It is not gold that built history. It was the cold, hard endurance of iron. Thus, we stand at the precipice of the modern era, where iron would eventually give birth to the skyscraper and the steam engine. But we must remember that for thousands of years, it was beaten out by hand, a laborious rhythm of hammer and tong. It was a gritty, dirty business that stained the hands of the artisan, yet provided the backbone for every empire that dared to rise. As the monolithic structure of the Roman Empire fractured,
The grand, state-sponsored factories fell into silence. The production of metal retreated from the industrial scale back into the shadows of the local village. Yet, in this supposed darkness, the art of the smith did not vanish. Rather, it became personal, intimate, and deeply superstitious.
To the medieval peasant, the blacksmith was a figure commanding fear and respect in equal measure. He was the master of fire, a man who could take the bleeding red ore of the earth and bind it into shapes of utility and war. His workshop was a place of sparks and shadows, a veritable temple to the old gods of the underground.
Seldom do we appreciate the physical toll of this labor. Without the hydraulic hammers of later centuries, every ounce of metal had to be beaten by human muscle. To forge a single shirt of chainmail required thousands of rivets, each one painstakingly set by hand. It was a display of patience that seems almost alien to our modern sensibilities.
While Europe struggled with the inconsistencies of bloomery iron, the East had once again ascended to a plane of metallurgical brilliance. In the crucibles of India and Persia, craftsmen were producing Wootz steel. This material was characterized by a distinctive watery pattern of carbides, a visual signature of its supreme quality.
The Crusaders, upon encountering these blades in the Holy Land, were baffled by their performance. A blade of Damascus steel could slice through a falling silk scarf or cleave a European helmet without losing its edge. It was a moment of technological envy that would haunt the Western mind for centuries, driving a clandestine quest to replicate the formula.
Back in the cold, damp forests of the north, the Vikings were harvesting the bones of the earth. Lacking deep mines, they relied on bog iron, deposits of oxidation found in the stagnant water of peat marshes. It was a poor, phosphorus-rich material, yet through sheer ingenuity, they twisted and folded it into the pattern-welded swords that terrorized a continent. Never had the seas seen such aggression fueled by such primitive geology. The Norsemen understood that even low-quality iron, when treated with reverence and carbon, could overthrow kingdoms. Their blades were often given names: leg-biter, golden hilt, imbuing the cold metal with a personality that transcended its inorganic nature. As the Middle Ages matured, the demands of warfare necessitated a shift from the flexible defense of mail to the rigid perfection of plate. The armorer became a sculptor of steel. He had to account for the articulation of joints and the deflection of blows, creating a suit that was as much a work of engineering as it was of art. It was during this era that the smith encountered the most recalcitrant, which means obstinately uncooperative, material imaginable. To shape a breastplate from a single sheet of metal required heating and hammering it thousands of times without cracking the crystalline structure. It was a high-stakes dialogue between the hammer and the heated steel. Slowly, the landscape of production began to shift. The Cistercian monks, those unlikely industrialists of the medieval world, began to harness the kinetic energy of rivers. They built water wheels not just to grind grain, but to power massive trip hammers. The rhythmic pounding of these machines echoed through the valleys, signaling the end of the solitary smith. With water power came the reintroduction of the blast furnace to Europe. No longer did the smith have to beat the impurities out of a sponge. Now he could melt the iron until it ran like water. This allowed for the casting of objects, a method that was faster, cheaper, and capable of infinite replication. If you desire to forge your own intellect with the same discipline that these ancient masters applied to their craft, and to ensure you never miss a chapter of our linguistic excavation, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Let us temper your English until it is as sharp as a Damascus blade.
The arrival of cast iron brought with it a sinister innovation, the cannon. Previously, siege engines were constructed of wood and tension. Now they were tubes of iron capable of containing the explosive fury of gunpowder. The walls of the feudal castle, which had stood impregnable for generations, were suddenly rendered obsolete. Little did the aristocracy realize that this metal would be their undoing. The cost of a cannon and the iron needed to feed it was beyond the means of a petty lord. Only a centralized state could afford such artillery. Iron, which had once empowered the local knight, now consolidated power in the hands of the king. Yet a crisis loomed on the horizon. The voracious appetite of the blast furnaces was consuming the forests of Europe at an alarming rate. Iron demanded charcoal, and charcoal demanded wood. In Britain, the ancient woodlands were vanishing, leaving the island facing a fuel famine that threatened to strangle the nascent industry in its crib. It was here that a confluence of desperation and geology occurred. The island was sitting upon vast reserves of coal, a black rock that burned with intense heat but released sulfurous fumes that ruined the iron, making it brittle. For decades, iron masters tried and failed to use this abundant fuel source.
Then, in a quiet valley in Shropshire, a Quaker named Abraham Darby made a discovery that would change the trajectory of the human species. By baking the coal to remove its impurities, he created coke. This purified fuel could support the weight of the ore in the furnace and burn hot enough to smelt iron without contaminating it.
Scarcely can we overstate the magnitude of this breakthrough. The link between iron and wood was severed. Now, the production of metal was limited only by the amount of coal one could dig from the ground. The price of iron plummeted, and for the first time in history, it became a structural material for civil engineering. The world began to harden. Bridges, previously built of stone or timber, were now cast in iron ribs. The Iron Bridge at Colebrook Dale still stands today as a testament to this era, a venerable monument to the moment humanity learned to build with fire and rock on a monumental scale.
This was the dawn of the machine. The soft, organic textures of the past were being replaced by the rigid, cold precision of metal. The steam engine, itself a beast of iron, was rising from the mines to power the very factories that birthed it. The rhythm of the hammer was replaced by the hiss of the piston.
The pastoral silence of the countryside was shattered by a new, relentless rhythm. Where once the sun dictated the hours of labor, the factory whistle now commanded the populace with an iron voice. Cities swelled like bruised fruit, bursting with an influx of laborers who had abandoned the plow for the loom in search of a precarious livelihood. In these rapidly expanding metropolises, the very atmosphere became a physical weight. Coal smoke hung low over the cobblestones, a fuliginous blanket that obscured the stars and coated every surface in a layer of grime.
It was a world of monochrome grays and deep, suffocating blacks, where the sun struggled to penetrate the haze of progress.
Never before had humanity existed in such close proximity to the machinations of industry. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and unwashed bodies, a pungent reminder of the density of modern life. Sanitation lagged woefully behind population growth, creating conditions in the tenements that were ripe for disease and despair. Into this chaotic environment stepped the new masters of society, the industrialists. They possessed a wealth that rivaled the landed gentry, yet their fortunes were built not on acreage, but on the efficient extraction of labor. They viewed the worker as merely another cog in the vast steaming engine of production, replaceable and expendable.
Inside the textile mills, the noise was deafening. The power looms clattered with a violence that shook the floorboards, drowning out all conversation. It was here that one experienced a true cacophony, which means a harsh, discordant mixture of sounds, a sonic assault that never ceased from dawn until dusk. Children, some no taller than the machines they tended, scurried beneath the moving parts to clear away debris. Their small hands were essential for the delicate work of piecing together broken threads, yet the danger was omnipresent. One moment of inattention could result in a tragedy that the overseers often viewed as a mere administrative inconvenience.
Seldom do we consider how this era fundamentally altered our perception of time. The fluid time of the seasons was replaced by the rigid, ticking seconds of the mechanical clock. Punctuality became a moral virtue, and the commodification of the hour turned time into something that could be spent, saved, or wasted like a coin.
Yet, amidst this squalor and rigidity, there was a terrible majesty to the engineering. The steam locomotive, a fire-breathing dragon of iron and brass, began to shrink the world. Distances that once took days to traverse were now conquered in hours, blurring the landscape into a streak of green and brown through the carriage window.
The train station became the new cathedral of the age. These vast structures of glass and iron vaulted over the tracks, celebrating the power of transit with an architectural grandeur previously reserved for religious worship. They were temples to movement, echoing with the hiss of steam and the roar of arrival.
Little did the passengers realize that they were riding upon the back of a geological revolution. The rails beneath them were forged from the very earth they traversed, a network of metal veins that pumped commerce into the heart of the nation. It was a circulatory system for an empire that was rapidly consuming the globe.
As the century progressed, iron gave way to an even more resilient material. Through the introduction of air into molten iron, Henry Bessemer discovered a way to mass-produce steel. This alloy was lighter, stronger, and more flexible, allowing architects to dream of verticality in a way never before thought possible.
The skyline began to pierce the heavens. No longer limited by the crushing weight of stone masonry, buildings rose with skeletal frames of steel, clad in thin skins of brick or stone. The modern city was beginning to take shape, a vertical assertion of human dominance over the forces of gravity.
This technological prowess culminated in the Great Exhibition of 1851, Housed within the Crystal Palace, a structure made entirely of cast iron and plate glass, the nations of the world displayed their industrial might. It was a transparent jewel box that showcased the disparity between the resplendent products and the grim factories that birthed them.
Inside this glittering venue, the Victorian public gazed upon the wonders of the age. Hydraulic presses, steam hammers, and intricate clocks stood alongside colonial spoils. It was a celebration of material culture, a proclamation that, through industry, humanity had finally tamed the wild, unpredictable chaos of nature.
However, this mastery came at a spiritual cost. The romantics and poets of the era wept for the loss of the sublime, seeing in the smokestacks and slag heaps a scar upon the face of the earth. They argued that in gaining the world of machines, we were losing the soul of the landscape. Scarcely could the average citizen escape the soot that permeated their existence. It darkened their collars, settled in their lungs, and stained the facades of their public buildings. The city was a living organism that breathed smoke and exhaled profit, indifferent to the health of those who dwelled within its bowels.
In the shipyards, the transformation was equally dramatic. The wooden hulls that had served the Navy for centuries were replaced by ironclads, impervious to traditional cannon fire. These floating fortresses projected power across the oceans, ensuring that the sun never set on the empire's industrial ambitions. The telegraph, running alongside the railway lines, annihilated the concept of distance in communication. Information now traveled at the speed of electricity, binding the disparate parts of the world into a single nervous system. News of a market crash or a declaration of war could circle the globe before the sun had set. We must recognize that this was not merely an economic shift, but a psychological one. The individual was becoming subsumed by the collective machinery of the state and the corporation. Identity was no longer defined by one's village or lineage, but by one's function within the vast economic apparatus. As we stand at the precipice of the modern era, the iron bones of the earth have been fully excavated and repurposed. The stage is set for the final act of our metallic journey, where the very atoms of these materials will be manipulated to birth the digital age. As the smoke of the Victorian furnaces began to clear, a new, invisible sovereign ascended the throne. Electricity, once a parlor trick for the amusement of aristocrats, became the lifeblood of civilization. It coursed through copper veins, illuminating the night and banishing the ancestral fear of darkness that had plagued humanity since the dawn of time. Then came the most surreptitious revolution of all. We turned our gaze away from the colossal iron beams and focused instead on the humblest of materials, sand. By refining silicon, we learned to etch cathedral-like complexity onto wafers no larger than a fingernail, collapsing the vast machinery of the industrial age into microscopic logic. Suddenly, value was no longer measured in tons of steel or bushels of coal. It became ephemeral, which means lasting for a very short time or lacking physical substance, yet infinitely valuable. Information became the new currency, flowing through fiber optic cables that crisscrossed the ocean floor like a nervous system for the planet. We now inhabit a world of glass rectangles.
These obsidian mirrors hold the sum of human knowledge, yet they demand our constant, unwavering obeisance. Rarely do we pause to consider the mineral extraction required to power these devices, the rare earth elements dug from remote corners of the globe to feed our insatiable hunger for connection.
Little did we anticipate the psychological toll of this instantaneous existence. The friction of distance has been obliterated, but in its place, a permanent state of urgency has taken root. We are tethered to a digital realm that never sleeps, a confluence of signals that demands our attention even when the body cries out for rest. The soot-stained hands of the past have been replaced by the repetitive clatter of keyboards. We manipulate symbols on a screen, detached from the physical consequences of our labor. It is a sterile environment, air-conditioned and hermetically sealed, where the seasons pass unnoticed behind tinted brass, and the rhythm of the sun is irrelevant. Looking back across the epochs, we see a clear trajectory. We moved from stone, which we could only shape, to bronze, which we could melt, to iron, which we could forge, and finally to silicon, which we can program. Each step has been a move away from the tangible earth toward the realm of the abstract. Yet, this progression is arguably a sophisticated illusion. We believe we have transcended the physical constraints of nature, but the servers that host our digital clouds generate immense heat. They consume vast rivers of electricity and water. The digital world is not a cloud at all. It is a heavy, industrial infrastructure, hidden from plain sight. What, then, is the fate of the human spirit in this synthetic landscape? We are biological entities evolved for the savanna, now navigating a labyrinth of algorithms. There is a profound dissonance, which means a lack of harmony or tension between clashing elements, between our ancient biology and our modern environment. Scarcely can one deny that we are entering a new phase of craftsmanship. As automation takes over the mundane, there is a resurgence of desire for the handmade, the tactile, and the authentic. We yearn for the imperfections of wood and the cold weight of brass, because they remind us of our own mortality and physical presence. We stand now at another threshold, perhaps the most perilous of all. As we breathe intelligence into inanimate matter, creating minds from code, we risk becoming obsolete in the very world we constructed. The tools we forged to serve us are beginning to speak a language we can no longer fully comprehend. From the sharp flint in a dark cave to the glowing screen in a high-rise apartment, our story is one of relentless innovation. It is a testament to human ingenuity, a drive to shape the universe to our will. But it is also a narrative of separation, a slow drifting away from the natural rhythms that once governed our lives. Perhaps the lesson is not found in the materials themselves, but in how we choose to wield them. Stone, iron, and silicon are merely vessels for our intent. We must decide whether we will use these tools to build walls that isolate us or bridges that reconnect us to the earth and to one another. The future is not written in stone, nor is it coded in silicon. It is being forged in the present moment by the choices we make today. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the ages, and thank you for watching.